And they've got a 100-year plan, which is supposed to come to fruition 100 years after the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. That means that 2049 is the date in which China intends to be the hegemon, the one single dominant power in the world, replacing the United States, dominating the United States. By 2035, it wants to dominate Asia.
Welcome to another episode of Counterculture, the show that stands at the intersection of reason and faith in the battle against sentimentality. Is China having its Berlin Wall moment? Is the Chinese Communist Party about to join the Soviets on the ash heap of history? That's what Stephen Mosher recently argued. Mosher is the president of the Population Research Institute and an expert on China whose scholarly research on that country dates back more than 4 decades. Mosher points to vacant properties, collapsing real estate prices, and double-digit youth unemployment, driving an exodus from China the likes of the exodus from counties in America that voted for Joe Biden in 2020. It's that serious. If true, what horrors might President Xi and ChiComs inflict on their own people and the world on their way down? What can and should the United States do to expedite the demise of Xi's tyrannical regime? What role do mediated institutions like organized religion have in freeing the Chinese people from their subjugation? And what can we expect, per Chinese history, would come after? Mosher has contemplated many of these questions in his books on China, including his most recent offering, The Devil and Communist China, From Mao Down to Xi. But let's update our understanding in the context of the present dynamics with Stephen Mosher, who joins us now. Stephen, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
It's good to be here.
So let's just start with where China is positioned right now, because I want to, and I think a lot of people want to understand and try to sift through the competing characterizations we hear. We hear from the Biden administration that we want competition, not confrontation. That sort of suggests that they anticipate China being a competitor or threat to America for some time to come. We know about the internal contradictions of any communist society that ultimately spelled doom for the Soviets. But yet we have even Republicans saying the greatest threat to America's hegemony, global hegemony, and the stability of the planet is the Chinese Communist Party. We had a whole subcommittee, special select committee, I should say, chaired by Wisconsin Republican Mike Gallagher on that. So against that backdrop, we hear you saying that their time is almost up. So a little bit more color on why you think that their demise is so imminent.
Well, there are a lot of questions in that question that I'd like to unpack. The first is that there's no question that China's at war with us. And I know when I say China, I mean the Chinese Communist Party, 94 million strong. Not the Chinese people themselves, who are the first and foremost victims of the Chinese Communist Party, always have been and always will be as long as the party exists. So the Chinese Communist Party has been basically at war with Western ideas of democracy and freedom and human rights, and particularly with the American ideals, since its founding, without a doubt. Mao always recognized, Mao Zedong, the longtime chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, always recognized that America was his principal adversary in the world, and he always planned to defeat us. That's why he went into North Korea in 1950 during the Korean War with hundreds of thousands of troops. And that's why China today is at war with the United States across all domains, except the kinetic. We're not firing missiles at each other or bullets at each other, although we could be soon. But China's at war with us in fentanyl. Sending fentanyl across our borders that kills 100,000 Americans every year. That's chemical warfare. They launder the profits from the fentanyl in China. That's how the Mexican drug cartels make their money. And they get the precursor drugs from China. They carried out a biological warfare attack on us by releasing COVID on us deliberately instead of trying to contain it within China. And they've never paid reparations or damages for that. That's chemical warfare. The cyber warfare has been going on for decades, since the invention of the internet by Al Gore. No, he didn't invent it, but you get what I mean. In 2016, in the Rose Garden Xi Jinping stood alongside Barack Obama and promised that China would stop its cyber attacks on American businesses, on the American government, and on the Pentagon. He had no intention of honoring that pledge. That's just one of those rhetorical devices that the Chinese Communist Party leaders use to play our goodwill against us. No one took that seriously at the time who understands what China is all about. And of course, they're trying to capture the high ground of high tech with artificial intelligence and electric vehicles and all of the other things, robotics we associate with technology in the 21st century and its advance. And they've got a 100-year plan, which is supposed to come to fruition 100 years after the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. That means that 2049 is the date in which China intends to be the hegemon, the one single dominant power in the world, replacing the United States, dominating the United States. By 2035, it wants to dominate Asia. That's only 11 years away now. And Asia means India, Japan, a lot of other countries in Asia that, quite frankly, don't want to be dominated by China at all. So the first thing we need to understand is that all of this talk about reconciling our differences, all of this jawboning that people like Janet Yellen do when they go over to China, when they say we've got to stop China from overproducing and from flooding our markets with cheap goods that they're selling less than the cost of manufacturing them, that's just wasted air. That's not going to have any effect at all. Now, if Janet Yellen had gone over and did a Donald Trump invitation and said, we're going to put 10% tariffs across the board on everything made in China unless you stop right now, that would have gotten their attention. But they will talk you to death. They're happy to sit across that table from you and talk all day long. That's what they're good at. Communist Party meetings tend to go long into the night, and so they can simply outlast you. So we are in a competition with China. The only way to win that competition is to decouple, shift our supply chains to democratic countries that respect our values, like India, like the Philippines, like Australia, Japan, or better yet, bring the jobs home. Reopen the factories that were shuttered by Chinese mercantilism, by Chinese cheating on their currency, by Chinese cheating on trade. That is the only way that you deal with China. And if you do that, here we come back to your question. If you do that, if you take the export sector away from the Chinese economy, and the export sector is still heavily dependent upon North America, particularly the United States, right? We all know that you go in a big box store in the U.S. and it's filled with Chinese-made goods. You take that export sector away from the Chinese, well, not much. The rest of it is state-owned dinosaurs, white elephants that require subsidies to operate and that operate at a loss. You can't do that. The only economically productive sector of the Chinese economy is the export sector. We can cripple that. And by crippling that, we will ensure that China's decline, which is already underway, accelerates. Why is it underway? Well, they're going down the socialist road to ruin once again. You see that in communist regimes from time to time. They destroy the economy. They starve tens of millions of people, in China's case, to death. And then somebody comes along and says, wait a minute, we've got to back off on going towards high communism right now. Let's allow the people a little breathing room. Maybe give them garden plots. They can grow their own vegetables. Maybe let them open small businesses. That's what Deng Xiaoping did when he came back to power in 1978, 1979, the four modernizations. And China embarked on, 30 years of growth because the private sector was allowed to flourish. Xi Jinping has said, no, we're not going to go down that road any further. We are going to move towards communism. And in saying that, he has put a target on the back of every wealth creator in China, and they are being eliminated. And I mean physically eliminated.
So, I mean, President Xi is his unwillingness to go down that road of some liberalization. Is that the lesson he thinks should be learned from the Soviets' demise, that when Gorbachev moved to open Soviet society a little bit with glasnost and perestroika, he accelerated the Soviet Union's demise and President Xi thinks that more command control, not less, is the remedy to their current problems?
Well, after the Tiananmen massacre, okay, which was a real shock to the Chinese Communist Party, June 4th, 1989, before that, for months, 1 million people had been in the streets of the capital city. The central square of the city, Tiananmen Square, had been occupied for weeks on end by unarmed students. And they were demanding an end to bureaucratization, an end to one-party dictatorship. They were actually holding up signs with quotes from Jefferson and Lincoln and Washington. It was very inspiring to watch. And Deng Xiaoping said to the military, it's time for you to go in, and it's all right if you shed a little blood. Well, they shed a lot of blood on June 4th of 1989, probably 10,000 people gunned down in the streets of Beijing. The actual number is a closely guarded secret by the Communist Party, which prefers to write the whole episode out of history. And then what the party did, in the days after that, they sent army trucks to all of the clinics and hospitals in Beijing, and all of the wounded, and there were probably 20,000 wounded, not dead, wounded during the carnage. They were all taken away in army trucks and never heard from again. So it's a matter of killing the witnesses, right? So that was kind of the high watermark of the drive for economic reform and political reform in China. The then General Secretary Zhao Zhiyang, who came from Guangdong in the south, was willing to talk to the students. Deng Xiaoping had him removed, moved in with deadly force and ended it. And they studied the collapse of the Soviet Union. And as a result, they put in place a patriotic education program from basically kindergarten through college to give a false history and a false accounting of the ideology of communism to people in China, to brainwash them, in other words. Brainwashing comes from China, you understand. It was invented by Mao Zedong and the communists in the 1930s. It's called in Chinese, Xinao, which literally means wash brain. So that's where we get the phrase. Xi Jinping is modeling himself in all things on Mao Zedong. And he wants to assert total control over the Chinese population. And that necessarily means asserting total control over all economic activity. And what he's done in his supposed anti-corruption campaign is purge everybody from competing party factions, number one. But he's also put a target on the back of CEOs and billionaires, wealth creators. And how has he done that? He said, well, everybody in China who is wealthy, he said, I don't have any objection to anybody getting wealthy as long as they use their wealth to serve the party. And he insisted that political commissars join the boards of directors of all the companies in China. Now, if I'm the chairman of a company, I'm the guy who built the company, and now there's a political commissar sitting at the other end of the table while we're holding a board meeting. I don't control the company anymore. The company belongs to the political commissar. And the political commissars in China have gotten wise. They think the best way to ensure that the company's wealth serves the party's interest is for me to charge the CEO, the wealth creator, with corruption and steal his property, steal his company. And that's what's happening. The most dangerous place to be in the world today for a CEO, for a billionaire, for a wealth creator is China. They're disappearing. They're being arrested. They're being tortured. They're being executed. They're being suicided, which means that they have to fall off the balcony of on the 25th floor of a high-rise building. So he is crushing the entrepreneurs in China, the generation of entrepreneurs who grew up during the reforms of the 80s and 90s and the first years of this century. And he's doing it because he can't help himself. He's doing it because he wants to control absolutely the Chinese people. He wants absolute control over the Communist Party. And in order to do that, he has to control where people go, what they buy, how they talk, what they say, who they talk to, where they assemble, and so forth. So he has to deprive them of freedom and concentrate all the wealth in his hands. And that's, once more merrily down the socialist road to ruin we go. We've seen this play before. Mao destroyed the Chinese economy with the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. He killed tens of millions of people in doing so, and had not a moment's regret for doing so.
Yeah, and that wasn't that long ago. I mean, it's 50 years ago, and yet here we are, what you're saying is on the cusp of repeating it again. So right. What you were talking about with respect to the kleptocracy there, and all things are effectively owned by the Chinese Communist Party, and CEOs getting sidelined if there's any resistance permanently. That makes the response that Xi generated at that Pacific Rim conference in San Francisco all the more curious, doesn't it? Where American CEOs were falling all over themselves to applaud President Xi. So two things. One is, do they not understand what's happening on the mainland in China, or do they just see that as a market opportunity for their companies? I guess, what does that say about what they think China's future is? They certainly weren't reacting like they thought China was a dying star.
No, but you see, they're basically being blackmailed. And the reason I say that is way back, I went to China in 1979, 1980. And the Fortune 500 companies in the early 80s were falling all over themselves to go into China because they were being told by Chinese Communist Party officials that we're engaging now in a foreign modernizations, and we want modern technology, and we want your company to come into China and bring its cutting edge technology, and we'll give you a share of the market. You will have access to 1 billion customers. And the idea that they might have a share of a market of 1 billion customers drew in almost everybody on Wall Street. The billions of dollars in investments began pouring in. All the major companies went in and opened factories, and they were told they must transfer their cutting edge technology to China, and most of them did. And so when you've got a company like Apple, which sells a lot of iPhones in China and manufactures even more, or when you've got a company like Tesla, which manufactures a lot of electric vehicles in China and sells them, or any company that's gone into China and gotten a certain amount of market share, you are effectively captive of the Chinese Communist Party, because you have long since learned, you learned shortly after going into China, that you were at the mercy of Communist Party officials. They could turn off the electricity to your factory if you didn't pay them a bribe. The regulations, the rule of law mean nothing. The contract that you sign means nothing. Actually, there are two forms of the contract that are signed, one in English and one in Chinese. The Chinese one is vague, and it's the one that is definitive. If you have a problem in China, the Chinese contract is the one that you go to court with, and you always lose because the judges are Communist Party officials. So basically, if you invest money in China, you are then held hostage. That's why it's easy to go into China. It's very, very hard to get out. And that's why they were paying $40,000 a seat to have dinner with Xi Jinping, because he didn't want, they don't want Xi Jinping to target their companies, you see.
So it's very difficult to get out because they've got so much in terms of sunk costs. Is that why?
Yeah, sunk costs, the investment. There are restrictions on currency exports. You can't simply get your money out of China that you make. The Chinese Communist Party wants you to reinvest it in China. And there is, in fact, a huge pool of money and people. Some of the money is owned by Chinese, including senior Chinese officials, all of whom have properties and investments and bank accounts overseas, because they too do not know in this unstable system when the hammer might fall, when their faction might be purged, when they might be accused of corruption. So every leading family in China, including Xi Jinping's own family, the ruler of China, his brother and sister and brother-in-law have overseas accounts and overseas investments. Doesn't he believe in the future of his own country? Well,
it's always good to diversify. Yeah. I mean, so then, just going back to where we started, then, with that backdrop and that historical context, give me a sense of where you think China is. You talked about the need to decouple, and that would expedite the perhaps deposing of President Xi and the Chinese Communist Party, or certainly maybe usher in a different regime. But Like, do we have a sense of, how tenuous his grasp on power is? Because you get a lot of competing analyses on that issue. I mean, we've heard from Gordon Chang, who sort of takes your position that that Xi is a paper tiger, that China is much weaker than it projects to be, and others that feel like the 21st century is going to be this existential struggle between America and the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, I mean, we enable the rise of the country that wants to destroy us, number one, but the Chinese Communist Party, and especially its leader, Xi Jinping, is busy destroying the industrial base that was built up by entrepreneurs over the last few decades. So it's really kind of a race to the bottom. But there are other factors here that are really now almost out of Xi Jinping and the Communist Party's control. One is demographic. The one-child policy, which began when I was in China, and which I was an eyewitness to. I was in the operating room when they were sterilizing young women to prevent them from having a second child. I was in the operating room when they were doing forced abortions on women who were in the third trimester of pregnancy, forced abortions by cesarean section. Over the course of the next 3.5 decades, the policy ran from 1980 to 2016. They eliminated 400 million unborn and newborn children from the Chinese population. So China's population is aging and dying more rapidly than any human population. And many of the babies who were eliminated were little girls because there's a preference for sons in China, right? So the cohort of young women in China is so small that every young woman in China would have to marry and have 3 children in order to offset the population decline that's already underway. China's population is declining. It has now been surpassed by India in total population. And that aging and dying of the population has serious economic consequences. It is the young who buy homes and cars. It's the young with the long time horizons who start businesses, who make long-term investments. As you get older, of course, you start to draw down your investments and use them for your retirement. So China has a demographic problem. It is growing old before it grows rich. It is still just a middle income country. It has an ideological problem because the leader of the country is trying to move in the direction of pure socialism. That's a fantasy, of course, and it also serves his interest because it allows him to accumulate more and more power in his hands. Xi Jinping is known in China now as the chairman of every. And you don't say that very loudly because you get yourself in trouble. But he's the chairman of the military commission. He's the chairman, general secretary of the Chinese, the head of government. He's also the chairman of all sorts of small groups within the government. Basically, the number two guy, the premier, has stepped out of the picture now. We rarely hear about him or see him because he's simply staying out of Xi Jinping's way. And this is a common pattern because as these dictators get older, they develop this kind of megalomania because they're surrounded by yes men, and they become paranoid because they're constantly worried about being overthrown, assassinated, or otherwise removed from office. And the problems get older, get worse as they get older. That's why Mao, in his 60s, launched the Cultural Revolution in 1966, which was just devastating for the Chinese economy and for the Chinese people. He was afraid of being overthrown or removed. And so he had his longtime political allies, even people like Liu Shaoqi that he'd worked with for decades. He had the Red Guards arrest him, torture him, and kill him. He had his longtime general, the one who had helped save his life several times, Peng Dehuai, arrested and tortured and eventually killed. He even had his longtime premier, Zhou Enlai, who had been his faithful follower since 1936, let him die of bladder cancer because Mao told the doctors, don't tell Zhou he has bladder cancer and don't treat the bladder cancer because he didn't want Zhou Enlai to outlive him. So this is the kind of paranoia that you see on the part of dictators as they get older, and I'm afraid that Xi Jinping is showing the same signs too of instability. That's another reason why we can't be optimistic about China's future. And then, of course, there's the overbuilding, 65 million apartment buildings, maybe more now, that are not occupied. They're half built, or they haven't been built at, well, the 65 million are half built. There are other apartment buildings that people have paid for that will never be built because their company, like Evergrande, has gone bankrupt. So that was a big chunk of the domestic economy, probably 35–40%, and now it is effectively gone. So if you take away the export sector, to come back to this main point, if you take away China's export sector, the domestic economy is in shambles, and you will put China in very bad shape very, very quickly.
I just want to make reference, since you mentioned the one-child policy that was in force for 35 years in China, and just how horrific that was. There's a great documentary done about 5 years ago called One Child Nation that documented exactly the sorts of things that you were saying. And it actually sort of shockingly, you learn at the end, not a spoiler alert, that it was the documentarian is a person who in America would be considered left of center, certainly pro-choice, not pro-life, which is rather ironic, but it sort of adds to the credibility of the horrors that she documented, given the fact that she doesn't share at least my sensibility, and I know your sensibility, when it comes to respect for life. So, I mean, just in terms of, the horrors that have already occurred, we talk about the Cultural Revolution. We've talked, somewhat, there's been some ink about, obviously, the Uyghur concentration camps there, but the one-child policy, because of our own crimes against humanity in the West, in this country with abortion, has sort of been understated. And that's something, obviously, that preceded Xi, but it's attendant to Chinese Communist Party rule.
Well, it is. I mean, you would almost say that Communist Party rule in China depends on a constant flow of human victims. And it does require, communism does require an enemy. It feeds on the hate that's generated by identifying a group of people as the enemy of the state, as counter-revolutionaries. And sadly, in 1980, that's precisely how the unborn were identified in China. They were basically identified, targeted as enemies of the state. Young women who were pregnant were told in my hearing, I was in these meetings with them, they had been arrested for the crime of being pregnant, and they were told in my hearing that for the good of the state, for the good of the country, for the good of the commune, for the good of the party, you have to abort your child. In other words, the child is the enemy of China and must be eliminated. And you talk about the number of victims of communism, probably 100 million people were killed, adults, in the course of the Communist Party's civil war and the 75 years of its misrule of China. But then you have to add to that 400 million unborn and newborn children, because infanticide was part of the one-child policy. Babies born alive were killed by lethal injection into the fontanelle, the soft spot of the skull, okay? So that's a total death toll of 500 million people. That's a death toll so large that you can't wrap your mind around it. And everyone was a human being, worthy of respect, worthy of human dignity, with certain inherent human rights to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, which was denied them. A death sentence was issued for them and carried out. They'd done nothing to deserve the death sentence. So I call the Chinese Communist Party the biggest killing machine in human history, because it clearly is. It has no regard for human life. It has always treated the Chinese people as a kind of disposable resource, or even renewable resource. And Mao said something just like that. He said, what does it matter if we go to nuclear war with the United States and lose 300 million people? Our women will make it up in a generation. And he just shrugged it off.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's hard to describe the level of evil of a viewpoint like that. But so now let's go back to this decoupling. Let's talk a little bit about the economics. What happened? What was the net of the Trump years, where he did impose tariffs, he took the tougher line, combined with COVID and a lot of the reporting that suggested that U.S. companies were moving their supply chains to countries like Vietnam or the Philippines, Australia, South Korea, for a variety of reasons, and that and so that was happening. Did it happen? Was what happened in terms of either onshoring in America or relocating supply chains off of mainland China? Was it substantial? Has it continued? Where does that stand?
Well, back in 2016, before the 2016 election, the results of which surprised nearly everybody, but pleased me because Trump had taken a hard line on China for the previous 2 decades. I mean, he wrote a book back in the late 1990s talking about how China was cheating on trade. So he was on China's case early. But back in 2016, the projections were that the Chinese economy was going to surpass the U.S. economy within the next few years. That didn't happen because of Donald Trump. And it didn't happen because once Trump was in office and lowered tax rates and imposed tariffs on Chinese-made goods, factories did start reopening in the United States, and the industrial base began growing again, albeit slowly. The tariffs, by the way, have been kept in place by the Biden administration. Trump has said if he's reelected, he's going to increase them to 10% across the board. That would be a brilliant move, and we need that to happen. But companies began leaving China because Trump and the Trump administration, led by people like Peter Navarro, made the case to the American people that it was not in America's interest to allow free American workers to be forced to compete against literal slave labor in China. When you mentioned the Uyghurs, they are basically slave labor working in Chinese factories, producing shoes and other goods for export, producing solar panels for export to the United States. Other factories opened up in India. India has been one of the big beneficiaries of the move away from China. And I applaud India. For goodness sake, India has a younger, more dynamic population and thus brighter economic prospects. It also has the rule of law. It's not without its problems, but it is a democratic country with freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, thanks in large part to the British. And is one of our allies in the developing Quad alliance between Japan, India, Australia, and the United States, which is self-consciously designed to contain Chinese aggression, which we see every day, by the way, aggression against Taiwan, bracketing the island with missiles, sending sorties of fighter jets around the island to circumnavigate the island, the aggression against Japan in the Senkakus, the claim that China owns the Ryukyu Islands, including Okinawa, because the daimyo, the ruler of Okinawa back in 1780, paid tribute to the Qing Emperor. That's the basis of a historical claim, territorial claim. The claim to the South China Sea, where China has recently said that it may be necessary for the Chinese Navy to sink the Philippine Coast Guard to ensure that the claim over the Philippine Islands, Scarborough Shoal, and some other islets is uncontested in the future. All sorts of very, very aggressive rhetoric combined with very, very aggressive actions. So I believe that China is fated to decline. The Chinese economy will never surpass that of the United States for economic reasons, for ideological reasons, and for demographic reasons. We can speed up that decline, and we should. And during its decline, however, China is not, a declining China is not without the danger that it poses. And it may be dangerous, more dangerous during its death throes than at any other time. So we need to be on guard.
Well, that's where I wanted to go next, is if it is in decline and if Xi is increasingly, has an increasingly large messianic complex and is increasingly paranoid, do we see a move on Taiwan? Do we see more formal and less subtle alliances with other enemies of America in the West, like Iran or Russia? What worries you about a China in decline, and particularly if and when it gets to death throes, as you say?
Well, China under Xi Jinping is lighting fires everywhere in the world. There was a meeting between Putin and Xi prior to the Ukrainian invasion, where they signed a half dozen different agreements, which had the net effect of bolstering the Russian economy prior to the invasion, when I think Putin and Xi knew that there would be sanctions imposed on Russia. So China gave the green light to Putin to invade Ukraine. Perhaps he wouldn't have done that without China's encouragement. China has armed uh, Iran with missiles and other modern technology, and also Iran, of course, helped Hamas in its attack on Israel. And it's very interesting to me that Hamas was using the reason why Israeli intelligence didn't detect the coming terrorist attack is that a couple of years ago Hamas switched to using all Chinese-made electronic equipment. All the phones are Huawei. All the computers are made in China, and they use an operating system from China, not from the United States. So that's how they were able to avoid being detected by Israeli intelligence. So they lit that fire. They're also encouraging Maduro in Venezuela to claim Essequibo, the Guyana, most of Guyana, and perhaps move militarily against that. What is all this about? Well, it's all about dispersing American forces to different parts of the world away from East Asia and depleting American munitions. We can't keep up with the need to arm Israel and Taiwan and perhaps Guyana and other countries in response to these Chinese provocations. And so what we're doing, we have now told Taiwan that the missiles and other defense equipment they were supposed to get this year and next year, they won't get because the shipments have been delayed because we're arming instead Ukraine and Israel. So you see, China has succeeded in distracting us and dispersing our forces and depleting our munitions. What we should be doing now to forestall an invasion of Taiwan, which Xi Jinping does want to carry out in the next couple of years, is arming Taiwan to the teeth. The people on Taiwan have had decades of freedom. They've had a dozen free elections for the highest office and a peaceful transfer of power from one political party to another, which is the ultimate test of a democracy. And they passed. They have freedom of speech, assembly, association, all the rest. And if you arm them, they will fight. 75% of the people on Taiwan say that they would fight in the event of an invasion by communist China of the island, but they need the arms to do so.
What about the Chinese Communist Party's Belt and Road Initiative and its impact in terms of trying to sort of buy influence around the world in South America, Africa, as well as through these international agencies, perhaps most notably the World Health Organization during COVID? This became more well known than it was previously. What's the impact of that? How much give them the power to activate more brush fires around the world?
Well, first of all, about the UN in general and all of its agencies, including the World Health Organization, the Chinese Communist Party, of course, which likes to draw up long-range plans, has for the last several decades been placing people strategically in these UN agencies and in the World Health Organization. Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus is from Ethiopia, but he's a puppet of China. That's where the money comes from. That's the country that supported putting him in the office he's now holding. So they're exercising power through these international organizations disproportionate to the amount of money they provide in support. Number one, the Belt and Road Initiative is very interesting. I've written extensively about the Belt and Road Initiative, and it was a great concern for me originally, but it turns out that it's very expensive to start negotiating and building projects in 80 or 90 different countries, each of which costs a great deal of money. And the problem that the Chinese Communist Party is having is the shoddy construction of these projects, so they tend to break down over time very quickly, and the fact that they're purely exploitative. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't do anything that's not in its own interest. So whereas you had if you have an American company investing, or if the British under British colonial rule, they didn't just take the minerals, they built roads and schools and hospitals and so forth. China does very little of that. It's a purely exploitative play. Now, having said that, I'm very concerned about the control of ports that the Chinese Communist Party has obtained. They have a port in Dubai that they could use to control access to the Red Sea. The Houthis are firing missiles at ships transiting the Red Sea now, with the support not just of Iran, but I think of China too. There are other ports in the United States and in South America, all around the world, that are controlled by China, that in the event of a conflict, we might not be able to use to resupply our ships. And of course, there's the bridge disaster in the United States with the Francis Scott Key Bridge, which my son is a graduate of the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy and drives ships. He said that it's very strange that the ship should lose power, be underway at 13 knots in a narrow channel without a single tugboat around, and then run into the bridge and collapse it. It doesn't seem like it's something that would have happened by accident, shall we say.
Interesting. I mean, okay. Well, well, it's an interesting perspective. At least it raises the question of additional questions needing to be asked about that, because, of course, anything like this these days, and the conspiracy theories abound. But I mean, but you know, if there is a trail of influence that sparks legitimate questions, then those should be explored. I'm all for that. Well, speaking of which, then, so the other piece of this is, and there's been much more about this, and much more coverage about this, and much more activity in Congress, at least in terms of rhetoric. The direct incursions into the United States by the Chinese Communist Party in the form of Confucius Institutes on college campuses, in the form of the ownership of farmland and land near sensitive places like military installations, obviously the infamous spy balloon, and so again, with our open border, the exponential increase in the number of military-aged men, Chinese nationals, that are coming into our country through the southern border, just as they are from many other countries, but it is notable because China is a little further away than Central America or South America. So give us perspective on these sort of direct, I don't want to say attacks, but these direct incursions to extend influence into America's institutions and the country writ large.
Well, I mean, I think it's not unfair to characterize them as attacks, because they are planned. China, the Chinese Communist Party's United Front Department has a huge budget, $12 billion the last time I checked, which it's using to promote things like Confucius Institutes on American college and high school campuses. And of course, they shouldn't be called Confucius Institutes, because Confucianism is dead in China. It was killed by none other than Mao and the Chinese Communist Party, quite deliberately. So they should be called Mao Zedong Institutes, or maybe now Xi Jinping Institutes. I've testified before Congress about them. And they should be shut down. Buying land in the United States, if you look at the land purchases, often they're strategically located around U.S. military bases, especially U.S. Air Force bases, or bases where there are U.S. Minuteman missiles up in the Dakotas, but also naval bases and Army bases as well. And I think they're being purchased and used for surveillance, electronic surveillance. So that should be forbidden. A couple of states have forbidden the purchase of land by states, hostile states, including China. I think there should be a national law in that regard, which would help to stop that from happening. The other thing that we should talk about is immigration, because over the last 12 months, we've seen probably around 40,000 Chinese, most of them young military-aged males, very fit, come across the southern border. A huge increase, the largest increase of any ethnic group over the last year has been from China. And you have to know a couple things. You have to know, first of all, that you can't get out of China without a passport and an exit visa. And so the Chinese government knows who's leaving China. And they also know where these people are going because there are instructions down in the Darien Gap on how to access on the Chinese social media, access money if you need it for your trip. That could be shut down by the Chinese government easily enough. It's not. There are directions on how and where to cross the border. Those things could be taken down by the Chinese media, which is carefully censored by the Chinese Communist Party in real time of everything the party does not want you to see. There are literally battalions of censors working 24 hours a day, assisted by artificial intelligence, to take down things that the party does not approve of. These things are allowed to stay up. These things are highlighted and available on people's phones. And then, of course, when the illegal immigrants from China cross the border, they ditch their original IDs and they're told on the Chinese language websites of the Chinese embassy and the consulates in Houston and San Francisco and Los Angeles to come to the consulate or come to the embassy, and we will issue you new IDs. So the Chinese government is actually collaborating, conspiring, you might say, with these immigrants to give them new identification. So we have no idea who they are. The Chinese Communist Party knows perfectly well who they are, but we've asked China to tell us the names of these immigrants. They refuse to release the information. I know that they know the identities of everybody who crosses the border illegally. I know that they could use face recognition technology and help us identify them. They don't want to do that. So I'm afraid that in the midst of this refugee flow, many of whom are economic migrants, they simply want to take their persons and their money to a place where both will be safe. I understand that. But in that flow of economic migrants, there are spies and saboteurs, potential terrorists, and people who do not wish us well. And we have no idea who they are and where they're going. The only thing we know for certain is we're pretty sure that they will not show up for their interviews in 5 or 10 years, however long the wait period is now.
Right. Well, but wait, so there are some you're saying there are some Chinese migrants that are economic refugees coming here for a better life, but so why would the Chinese Communist Party allow them to leave if they know everybody who's leaving? Why would they allow people to leave just for a better life if they're not otherwise in service of the party? Is that just to cover the actual saboteurs and assets that they're trying to get in the country, or why would they allow sort of both groups to leave China?
Well, first of all, these aren't political dissidents. If they were political dissidents, they would never get a passport. They'd never get an exit visa. They might very well be in prison. So these are people who have connections with the Communist Party. And I think a great many of them, perhaps the majority, are actual Communist Party members. They won't admit that during their interviews if the question is asked, because they wouldn't be admitted to the United States. I'm not sure under Biden, but the law says that any member of a Communist Party should not be admitted. So these are all people that, to some degree or another, the Chinese Communist Party trusts to serve its interest in the United States. And I think it has come to see them as a fifth column that it could mobilize and use in the event of a conflict, for example, over Taiwan. These are the people who might not be engaging in acts of sabotage, but they would be demonstrating in the streets of San Francisco or Los Angeles. They might be doing sit-ins or demonstrations at the offices of politicians. They would be a disruptive element in society, and they might very well actually serve as communities within which the actual spies and saboteurs and terrorists could receive help.
Well, sure. I mean, and we've seen this with other foreign nationals, that are covered with their countrymen who are otherwise law-abiding, but they provide aid and comfort to Islamic terrorists, for example. I mean, we've seen this, so this is not exactly a new play. We should be familiar with it.
Yeah.
So just thinking about this and the Biden family. I mean, is there anything about the Biden family's relationship with the Chinese Communist Party that is that we're not seeing, that we're not covering, or is it all just as obvious as it appears to be in terms of selling access to Biden, compromising Biden in order to enrich the family? Is it as straightforward as it seems from the testimony we've heard from Hunter Biden's former business partners and the relationships that have now been documented between Chinese Communist Party connected businessmen and the Biden family?
It is, and let me give you the Chinese Communist perspective on this. They refer to us as a money bags democracy. They think that any politician in any democracy can be bought using money, drugs, or honeypots, or a combination of all three. A honeypot, of course, is someone like Miss Fang Fang, who was very good friends with Congressman Eric Swalwell, who for some reason is still in Congress and still on the Intelligence Committee, or was taken off by recently, but was on the Intelligence Committee for years after it was obvious he had been sleeping with a Chinese spy. So honeypots, money, and drugs. And in the case of the Biden family, one kind of suspects that all three came into play with various family members. We don't know the details, but we do know that I've heard senior Communist Party officials in talks say, we buy politicians in the West, we give them one bag of money, and if that's not enough, we give them two bags, and if that's not enough, we give them three bags, and that usually got them. So they're very cynical about their approach to Western politics, and not at all shy about using every means at their disposal to compromise politicians. And of course, once you take the rule is once you take that first bribe, you might as well take the rest because you're compromised. You're owned. They could reveal your misdeeds at any time and destroy your career. And I'm afraid we have a Manchurian candidate.
If President Trump is reelected in November, you mentioned a couple things he should do straight away. The Chinese national ownership of land in this country, 10% tariffs across the board, which Trump has suggested. You say that's a good idea. Anything else that he should do, in your estimation, if you were advising him right away to do what we started the conversation discussing, which is hasten the demise of this totalitarian regime?
Well, yes, decouple economically. Japan has accelerated its decoupling from China by putting in place a fund to pay Japanese companies the cost of relocating from China to Taiwan or the Philippines or Vietnam or the United States or India. And I think I'm not in favor in general of government subsidies, but in this case, I would encourage strongly, including offering financial incentives, perhaps tax incentives for American companies to relocate out of China and hasten the decoupling that should take place. Number one. Number two, I would arm Taiwan to the teeth, quite frankly, and ensure that it has the means to defend itself. I do not want to be in a shooting war with China. No one does. And the way to forestall that is to arm Taiwan and our allies in Asia to the point where any attack would certainly fail. I would also enunciate very clearly our strategic doctrine to our allies, our friends around the world, that China itself is an evil empire. In the same way that Reagan made clear the diametrically opposed positions of the United States and the Soviet Union so very effectively during the middle of his terms in office.
Stephen Mosher is the president of the Population Research Institute. His latest book on China and he's written extensively on the topic, as you've heard over the last hour. We've talked. The latest is The Devil in Communist China, From Mao Down to Xi. Stephen Mosher, thank you so much for joining us. Really illuminating. Appreciate your time and insights.
Well, thanks for having me.
Please like this video and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And please leave a comment in the comment section. We'd love to hear your thoughts.